Most people think manipulation is something evil people do. That belief is why they lose control of their emotions, decisions, and lives. Manipulation is not about tricks. It's about understanding human behavior before it understands you. If you don't know how influence works, you will always be influenced. If you don't understand emotional triggers, someone else will pull them. This audiobook is not here to make you dangerous. It is here to make you untouchable. You will learn how control actually operates, quietly, slowly, invisibly. And once you see it, you can never be controlled the same way again. Chapter 1. You are already being manipulated. You don't wake up and decide to be manipulated. It happens quietly, automatically, without permission. You scroll. You agree. You explain yourself. You rush decisions you didn't need to rush. And you tell yourself it was your choice. That's the illusion. Manipulation doesn't announce itself. It blends into normal life, into conversations, into deadlines, into expectations. What you don't see controls you. Social pressure, guilt, urgency, the need for approval. These are not emotions, they are tools. And if you don't recognize them, they decide for you. You have a choice, but only after you see what's happening. Let's start with social pressure. You've felt it. Everyone has. Someone says, "Come on, everyone's doing it." A room goes silent after you disagree. A group looks at you waiting. Nothing violent happened. No threat was made. Yet your body reacts. Your chest tightens. Your mind searches for a way to fit in. That's not weakness. That's conditioning. Humans are wired to avoid social rejection. Manipulation uses that wiring. At work, it sounds like this. "This is how we do things here." Don't make it difficult. Be a team player. In relationships, it sounds softer. If you cared, you would. "I thought you were different." Online, it's even cleaner. Likes, trends, outrage cycles. You adjust your opinions without noticing. You silence thoughts before they form. What you don't see controls you. You didn't change because you were convinced. You changed because standing alone felt uncomfortable. You have a choice, but only if you pause long enough to feel the pressure without obeying it. That's the key. Now let's talk about guilt. Guilt is one of the oldest control mechanisms in human history. It works because it sounds moral. It feels responsible. It pretends to be your conscience. But guilt is often outsourced responsibility. Someone is disappointed. Someone is unhappy. Someone frames their emotion as your fault. And suddenly, you're apologizing for a decision that protected you. At work, guilt shows up as unpaid overtime. You stay late because you should. You answer messages because it would be rude not to. In relationships, guilt keeps you stuck. You stay longer than you should. You tolerate behavior you wouldn't recommend to anyone else. You tell yourself you're being kind. But kindness without boundaries is self-erasure. You don't need their permission to protect your time, your energy, your peace. It's not about being cold. It's about being clear. Guilt only works on people who explain themselves. You don't owe everyone an emotional refund. What you don't see controls you. Next is urgency. Urgency is manipulation in motion. Act now. This won't last. Last chance. Urgency shuts down thinking. That's the point. When time feels limited, your brain stops evaluating and starts reacting. Sales use it. Bosses use it. People use it in arguments. "We need an answer right now." "Why are you taking so long?" Just decide. Speed benefits the controller, not the controlled. That's the rule. If something truly benefits you, it will survive a pause. You have a choice. Slow down or surrender. That's the key. When you delay a decision, pressure loses its grip. Manipulation hates patience. Now let's talk about approval. This one is dangerous because it feels good. Approval is addictive. It releases comfort, belonging, validation, and it trains you. You start speaking in ways that are acceptable, thinking in ways that are rewarded, avoiding anything that risks disapproval. You begin editing yourself. At work, you stop challenging bad ideas. In relationships, you stop expressing real needs. Online, you perform instead of think. You confuse being liked with being respected. They are not the same. Approval seeking creates predictable behavior. Predictable people are easy to control. That's not an insult. That's a warning. What you don't see controls you. You don't need their permission to be steady. You don't need applause to be right. You don't need validation to be disciplined. It's not about confidence. It's about restraint. Here's the pattern you need to see. Social pressure pushes you to conform. Guilt pushes you to comply. Urgency pushes you to rush. Approval pushes you to perform. Different tools. Same outcome. You stop choosing consciously. And the most dangerous part? You feel normal while it's happening. That's why awareness matters. Once you see the mechanism, it loses power. You start noticing pauses in conversations. You notice when emotions spike for no clear reason. You notice when a decision suddenly feels urgent without being important. You have a choice, always, but choice requires space. So here's what you do. You stop reacting immediately. You stop explaining automatically. You stop rewarding pressure with compliance. You pause. You ask one question. Is this actually my decision? That question changes everything. That's the key. This chapter isn't about making you suspicious of everyone. It's about making you honest with yourself. Control doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from habits you never questioned. The goal is not to manipulate back. The goal is to become harder to manipulate. Calm, observant, unrushed. Because what you don't see controls you, but what you see loses its grip. You've seen the external forces. Now it's time to look inward. You've recognized pressure. Now let's talk about the entry point that makes all of this possible. You mastered awareness. Now let's talk about emotion. Chapter 2. Emotion is the entry point. Every form of manipulation begins the same way. Not with words, not with logic, with emotion. If someone can control how you feel, they don't need to control what you think. That's the truth most people avoid. You believe you're logical, rational, independent. But the moment emotion rises, logic steps back. Anger, fear, excitement, guilt, validation. These are not just feelings. They are access points. And emotion is always the first door. What you don't see controls you. Look at your last argument. You didn't lose control because of facts. You lost control because something hit your emotion. A tone, a word, a look. Your heart rate changed before your mind caught up. That's not coincidence. That's biology. Emotion narrows perception. It shortens time horizons. It pushes you toward reaction. That's why manipulators don't debate. They provoke. If they can make you angry, you become loud. If they can make you afraid, you become fast. If they can make you feel guilty, you become compliant. Emotion creates movement. Movement creates mistakes. That's the key. Fear is the most obvious entry point. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of missing out. You've seen it everywhere. If you don't act now, you'll regret it. This could damage your reputation. What will people think? Fear doesn't need proof. It only needs possibility. Once fear is active, your brain starts protecting instead of evaluating. You stop asking, is this true? And start asking, how do I make this stop? That's when decisions are made for you. You have a choice, but fear convinces you that you don't. Anger is just as effective. Anger feels powerful. That's why it's dangerous. When you're angry, you feel justified. You feel certain. You feel right, but anger is predictable. An angry person speaks more, explains more, reveals more. They show their position, their values, their limits. Calm people gather information. Angry people leak it. That's not opinion. That's pattern. If someone wants to destabilize you, they don't need to defeat you. They just need to irritate you. What you don't see controls you. Now let's talk about validation. This one is subtle. Validation doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like relief. Someone agrees with you, compliments you, acknowledges you. Your guard drops. You start trusting tone over intent. You stop verifying. That's why praise is often used before requests. That's why agreement comes before influence. Once you associate someone with emotional comfort, you stop questioning them. You don't need their permission to stay neutral. You don't need approval to stay alert. It's not about being cold. It's about not being dependent. Here's the pattern you must understand. Emotion bypasses discipline. Every time. That's why emotional control isn't about suppression. It's about delay. The most disciplined people don't feel less. They react slower. They create space between stimulus and response. That space is power. You have a choice. React or observe. That's the key. Let's make this practical. Next time emotion spikes, do nothing. Not forever. Just long enough. Don't reply immediately. Don't explain immediately. Don't decide immediately. Let the emotion peak and fall. Emotion always fades. Pressure doesn't survive patience. When you wait, you regain leverage. Speed is emotional. Control is slow. Remember that. Most people think emotional control means being emotionless. That's wrong. Emotional control means emotion doesn't decide. You can feel anger without speaking, fear without obeying, excitement without committing. That's discipline. It's not about denying emotion. It's about not letting it drive. What you don't see controls you. Once you see emotion as a signal, not a command, everything changes. You stop being reactive. You stop being predictable. And predictability is what manipulators depend on. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If someone can predict your emotional reaction, they can guide your behavior. That's why emotional restraint is dangerous to the people who rely on your reactions. You don't need to win arguments. You don't need to prove strength. You need to remain unreadable, calm, measured, delayed. You have a choice, always. This chapter was about the door, not the room. Emotion is the entry point. Once it's closed, influence struggles. You've learned how emotion is used against you. Now it's time to learn how perception itself is shaped. Because once emotion opens the door, framing decides what you see inside. You stabilize your emotions. Now let's talk about control at a higher level. Chapter 3. The Power of Framing Reality. You never react to reality. You react to how reality is presented. That's not philosophy. That's psychology. Two people can face the same situation and walk away with completely different decisions, not because the facts changed, but because the frame did. Whoever controls the frame controls the meaning. Whoever controls the meaning controls the response. That's the key. A frame is the lens through which you interpret events. It answers questions before you ask them. Is this an opportunity or a threat? Is this urgent or optional? Is this fair or offensive? You don't consciously choose the frame most of the time. It's handed to you, quietly, casually, confidently. What you don't see controls you. Look at how conversations actually work. Someone doesn't say, do this. They say, don't you think it makes sense to... That's framing. They don't say, you're wrong. They say, most people agree that... That's framing. They don't say, hurry up. They say, this is time sensitive. That's framing. The instruction is hidden inside interpretation. Once you accept the frame, the conclusion feels like your idea. That's why framing is powerful. It bypasses resistance. You have a choice, but only before you accept the frame. Let's take work as an example. Your boss says, we're behind schedule. That sounds neutral. It's not. The frame implies urgency. Urgency implies sacrifice. Sacrifice usually means your time. Notice what wasn't said. No deadline. No consequence. No decision yet. But your body already reacted. You leaned forward. You prepared to comply. What you don't see controls you. A different frame would sound like this. We need to review priorities. Same situation. Different meaning. Different outcome. That's framing. Now let's talk about arguments. Most arguments are not about facts. They're about frames colliding. One person frames the issue as disrespect. The other frames it as misunderstanding. One frames silence as avoidance. The other frames it as control. Once frames clash, logic becomes useless. That's why arguing harder rarely works. You're debating inside their frame. That's a losing position. You don't need their permission to reject the frame. That's the key. Here's a dangerous habit most people have. They answer questions immediately. Questions are not neutral. They carry frames. When someone asks, why didn't you reply earlier? The frame assumes guilt. When someone asks, don't you care? The frame assumes neglect. If you answer directly, you accept the premise. You start defending instead of choosing. A disciplined mind pauses. You reframe before you respond. You have a choice. Online framing is even more aggressive. Headlines don't inform. They position. Experts warn. People are outraged. This is what you should know. The frame tells you how to feel before you understand what happened. Outrage keeps you engaged. Fear keeps you clicking. Agreement keeps you loyal. That's not an accident. What you don't see controls you. A calm mind steps back and asks, what frame is being offered here? That question alone restores power. Here's the rule you must internalize. Facts rarely change minds. Frames do. That's why manipulators don't overwhelm you with information. They narrow your interpretation. They reduce options. They guide emotion. They define the problem. Once the problem is defined, the solution feels obvious. That's the trap. So what do? You slow the frame. When someone presents urgency, you ask for clarity. When someone implies guilt, you separate emotion from fact. When someone defines the problem for you, you redefine it silently. You don't argue. You don't explain. You observe. That's discipline. You have a choice. Accept the frame or reset it. Let's make this practical. Next time you feel pressure, ask, who benefits from this framing? What assumption am I being asked to accept? What happens if I don't respond right now? Those questions break the spell. That's the key. Framing collapses under inspection. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If someone can predict your emotional reaction, they can guide your behavior. That's why emotional restraint is dangerous to the people who rely on your reactions. You don't need to win arguments. You don't need to prove strength. You need to remain unreadable, calm, measured, delayed. You have a choice, always. This chapter was about the door, not the room. Emotion is the entry point. Once it's closed, influence struggles. You've learned how emotion is used against you. Now it's time to learn how perception itself is shaped. Because once emotion opens the door, framing decides what you see inside. You stabilize your emotions. Now let's talk about control at a higher level. Chapter 3. The power of framing reality. You never react to reality. You react to how reality is presented. That's not philosophy. That's psychology. Two people can face the same situation and walk away with completely different decisions. Not because the facts changed, but because the frame did. Whoever controls the frame controls the meaning. Whoever controls the meaning controls the response. That's the key. A frame is the lens through which you interpret events. It answers questions before you ask them. Is this an opportunity or a threat? Is this urgent or optional? Is this fair or offensive? You don't consciously choose the frame most of the time. It's handed to you, quietly, casually, confidently. What you don't see controls you. Look at how conversations actually work. Someone doesn't say, do this. They say, don't you think it makes sense to? That's framing. They don't say, you're wrong. They say, most people agree that. That's framing. They don't say, hurry up. They say, this is time sensitive. That's framing. The instruction is hidden inside interpretation. Once you accept the frame, the conclusion feels like your idea. That's why framing is powerful. It bypasses resistance. You have a choice, but only before you accept the frame. Let's take work as an example. Your boss says, we're behind schedule. That sounds neutral. It's not. The frame implies urgency. Urgency implies sacrifice. Sacrifice usually means your time. Notice what wasn't said. No deadline. No consequence. No decision yet. But your body already reacted. You leaned forward. You prepared to comply. What you don't see controls you. A different frame would sound like this. We need to review priorities. Same situation. Different meaning. Different outcome. That's framing. Now let's talk about arguments. Most arguments are not about facts. They're about frames colliding. One person frames the issue as disrespect. The other frames it as misunderstanding. One frames silence as avoidance. The other frames it as control. Once frames clash, logic becomes useless. That's why arguing harder rarely works. You're debating inside their frame. That's a losing position. You don't need their permission to reject the frame. That's the key. Here's a dangerous habit most people have. They answer questions immediately. Questions are not neutral. They carry frames. When someone asks, why didn't you reply earlier? The frame assumes guilt. When someone asks, don't you care? The frame assumes neglect. If you answer directly, you accept the premise. You start defending instead of choosing. A disciplined mind pauses. You reframe before you respond. You have a choice. Online framing is even more aggressive. Headlines don't inform. They position. Experts warn. People are outraged. This is what you should know. The frame tells you how to feel before you understand what happened. Outrage keeps you engaged. Fear keeps you clicking. Agreement keeps you loyal. That's not an accident. What you don't see controls you. A calm mind steps back and asks, what frame is being offered here? That question alone restores power. Here's the rule you must internalize. Facts rarely change minds. Frames do. That's why manipulators don't overwhelm you with information. They narrow your interpretation. They reduce options. They guide emotion. They define the problem. Once the problem is defined, the solution feels obvious. That's the trap. So what do? You slow the frame. When someone presents urgency, you ask for clarity. When someone implies guilt, you separate emotion from fact. When someone defines the problem for you, you redefine it silently. You don't argue. You don't explain. You observe. That's discipline. You have a choice. Accept the frame or reset it. Let's make this practical. Next time you feel pressure, ask, who benefits from this framing? What assumption am I being asked to accept? What happens if I don't respond right now? Those questions break the spell. That's the key. Framing collapses under inspection. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people live inside frames they didn't choose. They adopt beliefs from environments, reactions from groups, opinions from repetition. They think they're independent because the frame feels normal. Normal doesn't mean neutral, it means familiar. What you don't see controls you. Awareness gives you distance. Distance gives you control. This chapter was about perception, not emotion, not behavior. Perception comes first. If you don't control how situations are defined, everything that follows is reactive. You've learned how reality is framed. Now it's time to learn what happens when you refuse to fill the space with words. Because silence is not empty. Silence is pressure. You understood the frame. Now let's talk about the weapon that disrupts all of them. Chapter 4. Silence is a psychological weapon. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. That discomfort is not accidental. It's trained. Silence creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates pressure. And pressure forces mistakes. That's why silence is powerful. Not loud silence. Not dramatic silence. Calm silence. The kind that doesn't explain itself. What you don't see controls you. Look at how conversations usually go. Someone speaks. There's a pause. And almost immediately someone fills it. They clarify. They justify. They add context no one asked for. That reflex is not politeness. It's anxiety. Silence feels like exposure. People rush to escape it. And whoever escapes first gives away control. That's the key. Silence works because it reverses pressure. Normally, the speaker feels exposed. But when you stay silent, the pressure shifts. The other person starts wondering, did I say too much? Did that land wrong? Why aren't they responding? Their mind starts working for you. They fill the gap with assumptions. They reveal intent. They explain themselves. You learn more by not speaking than by talking. You have a choice. Speak or observe. Most people believe silence is weakness. They think it means they're losing. They think it makes them look unsure. That belief is exactly why silence works. Power doesn't rush to explain. Power doesn't scramble to be understood. Power waits. At work, silence changes dynamics instantly. When someone makes a demand, and you don't respond immediately, the demand softens. When someone pressures you, and you pause, they often add conditions, or backtrack. You didn't argue. You didn't resist. You waited. That's discipline. Now let's talk about over-explaining. Over-explaining is one of the most common ways people give away power. You think you're being clear. You think you're being helpful, but what you're really doing is signaling uncertainty. Every extra word is an invitation for objection. When you explain too much, you expose your reasoning, your priorities, your limits. You make yourself readable. Readable people are easy to control. What you don't see controls you. You don't need their permission to be brief. You don't need approval to stop talking. It's not about sounding smart. It's about sounding finished. Silence also interrupts emotional manipulation. When someone tries to provoke you with anger, guilt, or urgency, they expect a reaction. Silence breaks the script. No reaction, no escalation, no reward. The emotional energy has nowhere to go. And emotion without feedback collapses. That's the key. You don't need to win emotionally charged moments. You need to outlast them. Here's a pattern you should recognize. People who talk the most often have the least leverage. They negotiate against themselves. They reveal deadlines. They show desperation. Calm silence forces the other side to make the next move. And whoever makes the next move gives information. That's not strategy. That's awareness. Now let's address the fear. The fear is not silence. The fear is what silence might mean. What if they think I'm rude? What if they misunderstand me? What if I lose the opportunity? Those fears keep you talking, but here's the truth. If clarity requires constant explanation, the position was weak to begin with. Strong positions don't beg to be understood. They stand. You have a choice. Fill the silence or let it work. Let's make this practical. Next time you're asked a question that pressures you, pause. Not dramatically, just long enough. Count 3 seconds. Then respond with fewer words than expected. Or don't respond yet. Watch what happens. Most people will continue talking. They'll clarify. They'll justify. They'll show their hand. That's the key. Silence also protects your inner world. When you speak less, you reveal less. Your plans stay private. Your emotions stay contained. Your intentions stay ambiguous. Ambiguity creates space, and space creates control. This is not about being mysterious. It's about being disciplined. You don't owe everyone access to your thoughts. You don't need to narrate your decisions. What you don't see controls you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. People who fear silence are often dependent on feedback. They need reassurance, agreement, reaction. Silence removes that supply. That's why it feels powerful and threatening. But once you become comfortable with silence, you become harder to read, harder to rush, harder to manipulate. That's not aggression, that's stability. Silence doesn't mean you never speak. It means when you do speak, your words carry weight because they weren't forced, they weren't rushed, they weren't emotional. They were chosen. You have a choice, always. This chapter wasn't about muting yourself. It was about reclaiming space. Silence is not empty. It's active. It observes. It pressures. It protects. You've learned how silence disrupts manipulation. Now it's time to understand why some people are always controlled, while others never are. Because the most manipulable people share one trait. They are predictable. You mastered silence. Now let's talk about the real weakness. Chapter 5. Predictable people are controllable people. If someone can predict you, they don't need to persuade you. They just wait. Predictability is not comfort. It's exposure. The same reactions, the same habits, the same emotional responses to the same triggers. That pattern is not personality. It's a map, and anyone holding your map can guide your behavior without force. What you don't see controls you. Most people think predictability is reliability. They confuse consistency with discipline. They are not the same. Consistency without awareness creates routines that others exploit. If you always respond immediately, you can be rushed. If you always explain, you can be pressured. If you always seek harmony, you can be guilted. That's not stability. That's access. You have a choice. Remain readable or become deliberate. That's the key. Look at your daily behavior. What time do you check messages? When do you get irritated? What comments trigger you? These are not random. They're signals. People notice patterns long before they notice intent. At work, predictable employees get overloaded. They're the ones who always say yes. They're the ones who never push back. Not because they're capable, but because they're reliable to pressure. In relationships, predictable people are taken for granted. Their reactions are expected. Their boundaries are tested. Online, predictable users are targeted. Algorithms don't guess. They calculate. What you don't see controls you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Manipulation doesn't require intelligence. It requires observation. If someone watches you long enough, they'll learn when to ask, when to wait, and when to push. That's why emotional outbursts are costly. They teach others how to move you. Every visible reaction is data. Anger shows limits. Excitement shows leverage. Fear shows weakness. Calm shows nothing. That's the key. Most people try to become confident. Very few try to become unreadable. Unreadable doesn't mean fake. It means non-reactive. You don't need their permission to change your patterns. It's not about being unpredictable for attention. It's about breaking automatic responses. Discipline begins where habits end. Let's talk about habits. Habits are efficient. They save energy. But habits without review become vulnerabilities. If you always reward messages with instant replies, people learn to interrupt you. If you always negotiate emotionally, people learn to pressure you emotionally. If you always explain your decisions, people learn where to apply friction. That's not strategy, that's leakage. You have a choice. Audit your habits or be managed by them. Predictability also lives in language. Some people always soften statements. Some always overjustify. Some always apologize before speaking. Those patterns send signals. They say, I can be moved. I can be negotiated. I can be delayed. Powerful communicators vary rhythm. Sometimes brief, sometimes silent, sometimes decisive. Not random. Intentional. That's the difference. Now let's make this practical. For the next week, interrupt one pattern. Delay one response you usually send instantly. Say less where you usually explain. Pause where you usually rush. Don't announce it. Don't justify it. Just observe. Watch how people adjust. Some will get uncomfortable. Some will pressure. Some will reveal expectations they never voiced. That information is valuable. That's the key. Here's something most people miss. Predictability doesn't just help others control you. It traps you. You start acting out of habit instead of choice. You say yes because you always do. You react because you always have. You decide quickly because you're used to it. That's not freedom. That's automation. Discipline reintroduces choice. You have a choice, always. Calm people are hard to predict, not because they're chaotic, but because they're not driven by impulse. They don't react on schedule. They don't speak on cue. They don't decide under pressure. They create delays. Delays force others to reveal more. Silence, patience, observation. These are not passive traits. They are filters. What you don't see controls you. When you slow down, you see patterns in others. You see who rushes you, who flatters you, who withdraws when pressure doesn't work. That's awareness. Let's address the fear. People worry that changing patterns will upset others. It might. But ask yourself this. If your value depends on being predictable, is it value or convenience? You don't need their permission to evolve. It's not about becoming difficult. It's about becoming selective. Selective with time. Selective with energy. Selective with reactions. That's discipline. Here's the final truth of this chapter. Predictable people are easy to guide. Unreadable people force negotiation. One reacts. The other chooses. One leaks information. The other gathers it. You have a choice. This chapter wasn't about confusing people. It was about freeing yourself from automatic behavior. Predictability invites control. Awareness dissolves it. You've learned how habits and reactions expose you. Now it's time to understand the real currency behind all manipulation. Because once people can't predict you, they try something else. They try to buy your attention. You broke the pattern. Now let's talk about what they really want. Chapter 6. Attention is the real currency. Money is loud. Attention is silent. And silence is where control lives. Every system you interact with, workplaces, relationships, media, platforms, is competing for one thing. Your attention, not your opinion, not your loyalty, your focus. Because attention fuels behavior, and behavior creates outcomes. Whoever controls your attention doesn't need to force you, they wait. What you don't see controls you. Attention is limited. That's why it's valuable. You only have so many hours, so much mental energy, so much emotional capacity. Every demand on your attention is a bid for influence. Messages, notifications, deadlines, drama. None of them are neutral. Each one asks the same question. Will you look here instead of there? You have a choice. But only if you treat attention as currency, not noise. That's the key. Look at how people pull attention. They don't ask politely. They trigger emotion, urgency, outrage, flattery, fear. Emotion is the hook. Attention is the catch. Once you're engaged, they guide your next move. At work, attention is pulled with quick questions. In relationships, with emotional spikes. Online, with endless novelty. You don't feel controlled. You feel busy. That's the trick. What you don't see controls you. Here's a rule you must internalize. What you pay attention to, you strengthen. Every time you engage, you reinforce the pattern. If you respond instantly, people learn to interrupt you. If you react emotionally, people learn how to steer you. If you reward chaos with focus, chaos multiplies. It's not about motivation. It's about discipline. Most people leak attention. They scroll when they should rest. They argue when they should disengage. They explain when silence would suffice. They think attention is free. It's not. Attention is energy. Energy is life. You don't need their permission to withdraw it. That's the key. Now let's talk about validation. Validation is attention in disguise. Likes, praise, agreement. It feels good because it's feedback. But feedback trains behavior. You start doing what gets rewarded. You stop doing what doesn't. Slowly, your focus shifts outward. You ask, how will this be received? Instead of, is this correct? That's how attention becomes leverage. You don't need applause to stay disciplined. It's not about being liked. It's about being aligned. Here's how manipulators use attention. They starve you of it, then release it strategically. Silence followed by approval. Distance followed by warmth. Your nervous system notices. You start chasing the signal. That's not connection. That's conditioning. What you don't see controls you. The moment you notice this pattern, it loses power. Awareness breaks loops. Let's make this practical. Audit your attention. Where does it go automatically? Who gets it without earning it? What drains you without returning value? Write it down. Not to judge, to see. Seeing creates choice. You have a choice, always. Now let's talk about boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They decide what enters and what stays out. A disciplined boundary is quiet. No speeches. No explanations. No debates, just behavior. You reply later. You engage less. You focus longer, and people adjust. That's the key. Attention discipline also requires boredom. This is uncomfortable. When you remove constant stimulation, your mind protests. It reaches for noise. That's withdrawal. Most people can't sit in silence without checking something. That's not curiosity. That's dependency. When you tolerate boredom, you reclaim attention, and reclaimed attention creates clarity. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people are not manipulated by others. They are manipulated by distraction. They confuse movement with progress, busyness with importance, engagement with meaning. Attention scattered creates a fragmented self. Discipline gathers it back. You don't need their permission to focus. Notice how calm people operate. They don't chase updates. They don't react to every stimulus. They don't reward every interruption. Their attention is selective. That selectivity creates gravity. People lean in. They wait. They adjust. Because attention that is rare becomes valuable. Let's address the fear. People worry that withdrawing attention will make them irrelevant. The opposite happens. When your attention is scarce, it's respected. When it's constant, it's consumed. You have a choice. Spend it or invest it. That's the key. Here's a simple rule to live by. If it doesn't move your life forward, it doesn't deserve your focus. That doesn't mean no enjoyment. It means intentional enjoyment. Chosen, contained, not compulsive. This chapter was about economics, not money. Attention. Attention is the real currency. Behind influence, manipulation, and control. If others can't buy your attention, they can't guide your behavior. You've learned how attention is taken. Now it's time to learn how pressure is applied. When attention alone doesn't work, because when focus fails, manipulation speeds up. You protected your attention. Now let's talk about the force that tries to rush you. Chapter 7. Pressure works only on the unprepared. Pressure is not strength. It's urgency wearing confidence. When pressure shows up, it's because something else failed. Logic failed. Persuasion failed. Attention failed. So the timeline shrinks. That's not coincidence. That's strategy. Pressure doesn't convince. It corners. And corners make people move. What you don't see controls you. Pressure works on one assumption. That you are not ready. Not ready to wait. Not ready to lose. Not ready to say no. That assumption is often correct. Most people panic when time is limited. They feel exposed. They feel behind. They rush. And rushing is surrender. You have a choice, but only if you slow the moment down. That's the key. Look at how pressure is applied. It's rarely aggressive. It's framed as necessity. We need this now. This has to be decided today. There's no time to think. Pressure compresses space. It removes options. It narrows perception. It turns complex decisions into binary ones. Yes or no. Now or never. That's how mistakes are manufactured. What you don't see controls you. At work, pressure is disguised as responsibility. Deadlines appear suddenly. Priorities shift without explanation. Silence turns into urgency, and you respond. You skip evaluation. You absorb stress that wasn't yours. You act to relieve tension, not to make the right decision. Pressure transfers discomfort. The person applying it feels relief. You inherit the weight. That's not leadership. That's displacement. You don't need their permission to ask for time. In relationships, pressure becomes emotional. Why can't you just decide? If you cared, you'd know. I need an answer now. These are not questions. They are timers. They force commitment before clarity. And commitment under pressure often becomes regret. You have a choice. Delay or comply. That's the key. Pressure also shows up internally. You pressure yourself. You rush decisions to escape uncertainty. You act to feel productive. You move because stillness feels uncomfortable. That's conditioning. Stillness exposes doubt. Pressure hides it. Most people prefer movement over clarity. Manipulation relies on that preference. What you don't see controls you. Here's the rule you must internalize. If a decision can't survive a pause, it wasn't in your favor. Pressure fears time. Time allows analysis, comparison, perspective. Pressure collapses when you stop reacting. That's why calm people seem slow to others. They're not slow. They're deliberate. Let's talk about preparedness. Prepared people don't fear pressure because they already considered outcomes. They know what they're willing to lose. They know their boundaries. They know their pace. Pressure only works when you're emotionally attached to the outcome. That's the truth. If you need the approval, pressure works. If you need the deal, pressure works. If you need the answer to be yes, pressure works. Detach and pressure weakens. You don't need their permission to step back. Here's how you neutralize pressure. You acknowledge it without obeying it. You say less. You don't justify. You don't argue. You create distance. Distance restores leverage. That's the key. Let's make this practical. Next time someone pressures you, do this. Slow your breathing. Lower your voice. Pause longer than expected. Then respond with something simple. I'll get back to you. I need time to think. That doesn't work for me right now. No explanation. Watch what happens. Pressure often dissolves. When it doesn't get compliance, people adjust. Here's something important. Pressure trains people. If pressure works once, it will be used again. If it fails, it's abandoned. Your reactions teach others how to treat you. That's not personal. That's behavioral economics. What you don't see controls you. Most people believe resisting pressure means confrontation. It doesn't. It means non-participation. You don't need to win the moment. You need to protect your position. Silence, delay, boundaries. These are not aggressive moves. They are stabilizers. Let's address the fear. People worry that resisting pressure will make them look difficult. But ask yourself, difficult to whom and for what purpose? If speed benefits them and risk belongs to you, who should slow down? You have a choice. Pressure also reveals intent. When someone reacts poorly to delay, they weren't seeking agreement. They were seeking control. That information matters. Prepared people watch reactions. Unprepared people rush decisions. That's the difference. Here's the deeper truth. Pressure exists because uncertainty exists. Someone wants closure, resolution, relief. You don't need to provide that at your own expense. It's not your job to manage other people's anxiety. That's discipline. Calm people create a strange effect. They make pressure visible. When you don't rush, others feel exposed. Their urgency looks desperate. Their demands look unreasonable. Time reveals imbalance. That's why patience is powerful. Let's lock this in. Pressure works only on the unprepared. Prepared means you know your limits. You accept trade-offs. You don't chase relief. You don't need perfect answers. You need steady behavior. You have a choice, always. This chapter was about force, not physical force. Psychological force. Pressure is used when influence fails. Now you know how to slow it, deflect it, and expose it. But pressure is not the end game. When pressure stops working, manipulation changes shape. It becomes internal, subtle, quiet. It becomes discipline, or the lack of it. You resisted pressure. Now let's talk about the foundation that makes you immune. Chapter 8. Control yourself before you try to control anything. Most people want control over outcomes, money, respect, influence. They skip the hardest part, control over self. That's why manipulation works. That's why pressure works. That's why emotions override logic. Because without self-control, everything else is reaction. You don't lose power to other people. You give it away through impulse. What you don't see controls you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you can't control your emotions, your attention, your habits, you are already controlled, not by a person, by patterns. Patterns of comfort, patterns of avoidance, patterns of instant relief. Manipulation doesn't need access to your mind. It only needs access to your impulses. That's the key. Look at how people behave under stress. They scroll. They talk more. They seek reassurance. They make fast decisions. Not because it's smart, but because it soothes discomfort. Impulse is the enemy of discipline. And discipline is the foundation of immunity. You have a choice. Soothe or stabilize. Self-control is not suppression. It's regulation. You don't eliminate emotion. You delay action. That delay creates space. Space creates clarity. Clarity creates leverage. Most people skip the delay. They react, then justify. That order keeps them weak. Strong minds reverse it. Observe. Pause. Choose. That's the key. Let's talk about impulse. Impulse is action without thought. Thought is friction. Friction slows behavior. Manipulation hates friction. That's why emotional spikes are engineered. They reduce friction. Anger removes caution. Fear removes patience. Excitement removes restraint. If someone can spike your emotion, they bypass your discipline. What you don't see controls you. Self-control begins with awareness of patterns. When do you feel the urge to react? What situations make you restless? Where do you seek quick relief? Those moments are not random. They are entry points. Most people never study their impulses. They obey them. That obedience is invisible slavery. You don't need their permission to resist yourself. Let's talk about habits again, but deeper. Habits are shortcuts. They save effort, but they also bypass choice. If your habit is distraction under discomfort, you will never build resilience. If your habit is explanation under pressure, you will always negotiate against yourself. Discipline replaces habits with rules. Rules don't care how you feel. That's why they work. Here's a rule you should adopt. No major decision. While emotionally elevated, no reply. While triggered, no commitment. Under urgency. That rule alone will eliminate most manipulation. That's the key. Self-control also means accepting discomfort. Most people react because they can't sit with tension. Silence feels awkward. Uncertainty feels unsafe. Boredom feels unbearable. So they move. Movement feels like control. It's not. Stillness is control. Stillness forces emotion to pass. Without action, emotion always passes. Remember that. Let's make this practical. Next time you feel an urge to act, do nothing. Not forever. Just for a few minutes. Notice the body. Notice the thoughts. Watch the urge rise and fall. You'll realize something important. You didn't need to act. You only needed to endure. Endurance builds authority internally first. Most people chase external discipline. Schedules, apps, motivation. Those help, but they don't solve the core problem. The core problem is internal permission. You give yourself permission to break rules when emotion spikes. Disciplined people remove that permission. They pre-decide. They don't ask how they feel. They act according to standards. That's not rigidity. That's freedom. Here's the paradox. The more you control yourself, the less you need to control others. You stop forcing outcomes. You stop chasing reactions. You stop negotiating your values. Calm replaces urgency. Consistency replaces effort. People feel it. They adjust around you. That's influence without manipulation. Let's address the fear. People think self-control makes life dull. It doesn't. It makes life stable. Stability creates confidence. Confidence attracts opportunity. Chaos repels it. You don't need to be intense. You need to be steady. That's the key. Self-control also protects your identity. When you react impulsively, you act out of character. You say things you don't stand by. You commit to things you regret. That fragments trust with yourself. Discipline rebuilds that trust. And self-trust is power. Here's the truth few people accept. You cannot outthink manipulation if you can't outlast emotion. Control starts before strategy, before language, before influence. It starts with restraint. What you don't see controls you. Once you see your impulses clearly, they stop owning you. This chapter was the foundation, not tactics, not tricks. Stability. You learned that without self-control, every other defense fails. Now it's time to build something stronger. Because once you control yourself, you become resistant. And resistance is built through one thing: consistency, rules, boundaries, routine. You stabilize the core. Now let's build the armor. Chapter 9. Discipline makes you hard to influence. Discipline is not motivation. Motivation fades. Discipline stays. That's why discipline is feared. It doesn't respond to pressure. It doesn't negotiate with emotion. A disciplined person is hard to move, hard to rush, hard to manipulate. Because discipline removes options. What you don't see controls you. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think it's intensity. They think it's willpower. They think it's pushing harder. It's none of that. Discipline is pre-commitment. You decide in advance how you will behave before emotion enters the room. That's the key. Manipulation relies on flexibility, not adaptability. Weak flexibility, the kind that bends under mood, under guilt, under urgency. If your behavior changes based on how you feel, you are easy to steer. If your behavior is rule-based, influence struggles. Rules don't argue. They execute. Look at undisciplined behavior: sleeping late when tired, responding instantly when anxious, breaking routines when bored. Each break teaches your nervous system. The comfort comes first. Comfort-seeking creates loopholes. And loopholes are entry points. What you don't see controls you. Discipline closes those entry points. Not by force, by consistency. You wake up at the same time. You work at the same pace. You respond on your schedule. Not because you feel like it, because it's decided. That decision removes leverage from others. You don't need their permission to follow your rules. Here's something important. Discipline looks boring from the outside. No drama, no urgency, no emotional spikes. That's why it works. Manipulation feeds on chaos. Discipline starves it. a calm routine, is invisible armor. That's the key. Let's talk about boundaries. Boundaries are discipline applied socially. They are not speeches. They are patterns. You don't answer late-night messages. You don't explain repeated decisions. You don't negotiate your standards. At first, people test boundaries. That's normal. Testing reveals expectations. If you hold the line, the testing stops. If you bend, the pressure increases. Your behavior trains others. Discipline also changes how you speak. You say less. You repeat less. You clarify once, not because you're cold, but because repetition signals uncertainty. Clear rules reduce conversation. That's power. Most people want freedom. They think discipline removes it. The opposite is true. Undisciplined people are slaves to mood, to distraction, to reaction. Disciplined people act regardless. That reliability creates trust internally and externally, and trust creates influence. Here's a rule to adopt. If it's important, it's scheduled. If it's emotional, it's delayed. If it's pressured, it's questioned. That rule alone will eliminate most manipulation. That's the key. Let's make this practical. Choose 3 non-negotiables: a wake-up time, a work block, a response boundary. Write them down. Follow them for 30 days, without exception. No explanations, no exceptions, no drama. Watch what happens. Your confidence stabilizes. Your reactions slow. External pressure weakens. Here's what manipulators hate: predictable discipline. They can't rush you. They can't guilt you. They can't destabilize you, because your behavior doesn't depend on them. It depends on standards. What you don't see controls you. Discipline also exposes others. When you stay consistent, people reveal their intent. Those who respect you adjust. Those who want control escalate. That information matters. You don't need to confront. You just observe. Observation is enough. Let's address the fear. People worry discipline will make them rigid. It won't. It will make you selective. Selective with time. Selective with energy. Selective with people. Selectivity is not arrogance. It's survival. Here's the deeper truth. Discipline is quiet dominance. No speeches. No displays. No force. Just consistency. That doesn't bend. Over time, people stop trying to move you. That's influence. Most people try to be impressive. Disciplined people aim to be immovable. That difference changes everything. You don't need to be louder. You don't need to be faster. You don't need to be emotional. You need to be steady. That's the key. This chapter was about armor. Invisible. Unspoken. Effective. Discipline doesn't make you powerful overnight. It makes you unusable for manipulation. Now there's only one step left. Awareness. Discipline. Boundaries. All of it leads to one outcome. Freedom. But freedom isn't loud. It's permanent. You built the armor. Now let's seal the system. Chapter 10. Awareness is permanent freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever you want. That's impulse. Freedom is not reacting when you're triggered. That's discipline. Freedom is awareness that never turns off. Once you see how influence works, it stops working the same way. Not because the world changes, but because you do. What you don't see controls you. This chapter is about seeing clearly and staying clear. Awareness is not knowledge. Knowledge can be ignored. Awareness can't. You can forget advice. You can't unsee patterns. Once you notice pressure, you feel it sooner. Once you notice framing, you hear it instantly. Once you notice emotional hooks, you sense them before they land. That early detection is freedom. That's the key. Most people think freedom is external. More money, more options, more power. But people with options are still manipulated. People with money are still reactive. People with power still panic. Why? Because awareness was never trained. Without awareness, every advantage leaks. Awareness is the ability to observe yourself while something is happening. Not after, not in hindsight, in the moment. You feel anger rise, and you notice it. You feel urgency press, and you notice it. You feel the urge to explain, and you notice it. That noticing creates a gap. And the gap is where freedom lives. You have a choice. Always. Let's be clear. Awareness doesn't mean paranoia. You're not assuming bad intent. You're recognizing patterns. Pressure is pressure, whether intentional or not. Framing is framing, whether conscious or not. Emotion is emotion, whether justified or not. Awareness doesn't judge. It observes. Observation neutralizes. Think back through this audiobook. Social pressure, emotion, framing, silence, predictability, attention. pressure, self-control, discipline. All of them point to one thing: automatic behavior. Manipulation feeds on automatic behavior. Awareness shuts it down. What you don't see controls you. What you see loses authority. That's the rule. Most people live on autopilot. They respond because it's expected. They decide because it's urgent. They speak because silence feels uncomfortable. Awareness turns autopilot off. You start asking better questions. Why does this feel rushed? Why am I being framed as responsible here? Why do I feel the need to respond right now? Those questions are disruptive, not outwardly, internally. An internal disruption changes behavior. Awareness also changes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who must react. You become someone who chooses. That shift is subtle, but permanent. Once you identify as calm, you protect calm. Once you identify as disciplined, you protect standards. Once you identify as observant, you stop chasing noise. That's freedom without rebellion. Let's talk about permanence. Motivation fades. Rules can be broken. Discipline can slip. Awareness stays, because awareness doesn't require effort. It requires honesty. You don't force yourself to notice. You allow yourself to see. Seeing is effortless. Once you stop resisting it, here's the uncomfortable truth. Many people don't want awareness, because awareness removes excuses. You can't say, "I didn't realize." When you did, you can't blame pressure when you saw it coming. Awareness creates responsibility, and responsibility is heavy, but it's also empowering. You don't need their permission to take responsibility for your reactions. Awareness also changes how you relate to others. You stop taking things personally. You stop absorbing emotions that aren't yours. You stop explaining yourself to feel understood. You recognize patterns instead of personalities. You see behavior, not stories. That distance protects you. Let's make this practical. From now on, do this. When emotion rises, label it silently. Pressure, guilt, urgency, validation. Don't judge it. Just name it. Naming creates separation. Separation creates choice. That's the key. When someone speaks, listen for framing. What assumption is being embedded? What outcome is being nudged? You don't need to respond differently. You just need to notice. Awareness doesn't always change action. It changes ownership. You act because you chose to, not because you were pushed. Awareness also teaches patience. You stop rushing clarity. You stop forcing closure. You let situations reveal themselves. Time becomes an ally instead of an enemy. Manipulation hates time. Awareness loves it. Here's something most people miss. Awareness is quiet. No one applauds it. No one notices it. But everything shifts because of it. Your posture changes. Your voice slows. Your reactions soften. People feel it. They don't know why, but they adjust. That's influence without effort. Awareness also exposes incompatibility. You see who thrives on your reactions, who disappears when you stop explaining, who escalates when pressure fails. That information matters. You don't confront it. You file it. Awareness doesn't need drama. Let's address the fear. People worry that awareness will make life dull. It won't. It will make life cleaner. Less chaos, less regret, less emotional waste. Clarity is not boring. It's efficient. Here's the final truth. You don't need to manipulate anyone. You don't need to dominate. You don't need to outsmart. You need to remain awake. Awake to emotion. Awake to pressure. Awake to framing. Awake to yourself. That awareness is permanent freedom. This audiobook was not about control over others. It was about removing their access to you. You learned to pause, to see, to choose. Now the responsibility is yours. Not to use these insights aggressively, but to live deliberately. The challenge is simple. For the next 30 days, react slower, speak less, observe more. No announcements, no explanations, just awareness. Because once you see clearly, you cannot be controlled the same way again. And that is real power. Manipulation only works on the unaware. Once you understand emotional triggers, urgency, silence, and framing, the spell breaks. You stop reacting, you stop explaining, you stop rushing. You become calm where others are emotional, still where others panic, disciplined where others seek approval. This audiobook was not about controlling people. It was about removing their control over you. Now the responsibility is yours. Observe more, react less. Slow down your decisions. The challenge is simple. For the next 30 days, do not react immediately. Pause, think, choose. Because the moment you control yourself, no one else can.